Hello everyone, welcome to season 2 of Grustlers. This is a podcast where we dive deep into the journeys of risk leaders and how they're paving the new frontiers in cybersecurity. In season 1, we interviewed 8 folks. We had 8 episodes, and the response to season 1 actually brought us to season 2 because we were encouraged to follow on the effort. In most of the episodes in season 2, Todd would actually be the host. But this is and we let Todd introduce himself, but this is a departure from other episodes in season 2 where I'm the host because Todd, we're going deep into Todd's journey in this episode. So Todd, thank you for coming. Thanks for taking the time. Just a quick introduction to Todd before he goes into his story. Todd is a solutions architect at threat automation. He helps us define our cybersecurity controls and how we think about risk management within the company. He's also the CISO at Zururi, and an advisor to a bunch of startups, including companies like Box and Zoom. So Todd, welcome to the show. Thanks for taking the time. Why don't we start with your journey around how you landed yourself into compliance in GRC and risk management?
Sure. So, I was a business major in college, but I just happened to be working in the computer lab, so I could have a paying job during college. So I was the VAX administrator. And then when you graduate from college and you don't really know what you're going to do with a business degree, you kind of just scrape for whatever job you can get. And back in the 90s, that job was working at a help desk, right? And so my first job was working at a help desk. I'll call it a big outsourced help desk from a blue company, and I was embedded in a financial institution. And so I got to play with Lotus Notes and things like that. It was real fun. And then I kind of graduated from that, and I moved into leading IT efforts in commercial real estate. And when 2001 came around, .com crash, all that fun stuff, I was in San Francisco, fresh in San Francisco for 6 months, and then I lost my job 6 months later. And that was rough. But luckily I had all my certs at the time, and certs back then meant something because you couldn't just Google anything. There was no Google. So when you get your MCSE on Windows NT4, it means you actually worked for it, right? So I had all those because my previous company paid for those, and I started looking for a job, and I landed a job at a biotech company. And that's kind of where I learned a different kind of IT, because everything in IT was controlled. You had to follow your policies and procedures, and you couldn't go outside of that. So if we had to change memory in a server, that was a change control. We had to write up a document, get it signed off by everybody, and then it would take 2 seconds to change the memory, right? So I worked in that kind of environment for about 15 years, from 2001 till God knows when, 2018. And during that time, I was early customer at a lot of companies like Box and Zoom, and I had the honor of being on their advisory boards in the early days. So that was interesting. And like I mentioned, at biotech companies, everything is controlled. There's a lot of compliance that you have to follow in order to build a lab. So if you want to build a lab, it has to be CLIA certified or some other certification depending on what you're doing in that lab. So there's a lot of audits, there's a lot of paperwork, and there's a lot of change control in those situations.
I was going to ask, when did you start consulting with smaller companies, startups?
So that was about 2020 or so. I didn't have one of my biotech companies, the drug got pulled off the market, so we all lost our jobs again. So that happens in this market and Silicon Valley, so you kind of get used to it. So I did the consulting thing, and I started helping early stage startups with their SOC 2 compliance. And that was my big thing. So I did about 10 of those in the course of a couple of years. And then I just had the startup bug because, hell, if you work for a big company, you get laid off. If you work for a small company, you get laid off. So there's no world anymore where you work at a job for 20 or 30 years, at least not that I could find. And so I just started working for a few startups. And of course, I did other compliance and security and all that as well. So it's been a long journey, and I've done every job in IT and security that I can possibly think of.
That's actually quite interesting, Todd. And, so you made a transition from working in environments which were large and complicated, started helping other startups go through their software compliance. So when you think about your journey of, helping startups being compliant, what do you think were some of the rookie mistakes they made? What were some of the situations where you think the situation could have been dealt with better?
So most of these startups want to get their SOC 2 with the intention of looking secure to other companies, right? So they can sell to mid-market, larger companies and pass the questionnaires and all that stuff, right? Because the first question is, do you have a SOC 2, right? And if you can check mark that and say yes, then you're doing something, right? And so, we'd go through the process. And with startups, it's a lot easier because all their systems are in the cloud. Everything's on some cloud system, whether AWS, GCP, whatever, right? And so for all these cases, I used automated compliance solution, just like Scrut has. And we just start mapping all of the cloud systems to the tool. And we basically put it in autopilot to find all the problems, right? And then we would identify all the problems, but then we'd identify a lot more stuff that they didn't have, right? So do you have training? Do you have the agent installed? Do you have password manager? So there's a lot of manual work we had to do on all the employees' computers. But generally that was easy because it was 10 to 20, maybe 30 people at these companies at the time of when we're doing the SOC 2. So generally we could get them done in 8 months or so. Because we had full attention of the dev team. If there's something wrong, I could assign it to them to go fix it, go turn on MFA or whatever the control is that they're missing, right? But the challenge was the manual labor when I don't have access to their systems, and they don't have any policies in place, all this stuff, right? So the manual effort came in there. So writing policies, making sure all the basic security controls were turned on in Google or Microsoft, whatever they were using. Those were the most laborious parts at the beginning.
Got it. And I have a question around, because typically most of the frameworks would have an annual re-audit or a surveillance audit. How did companies navigate that? Because the bulk of the compliance effort, usually for small companies, is concentrated for about anywhere between 3 to 6 months. But after they actually become compliant, how did they follow it out? Did you see them making any mistakes there? Did you have situations where the surveillance audits actually did not work out the way they were planned?
Yes, absolutely. So some companies were good at it, and they looked at the tool on a weekly basis, and they would fix whatever popped up, right? But then I had some companies that, hey, they got their SOC 2 certificate, they got that little logo, they're like, woohoo, have a party, and then forget about it, right? And then the auditors call the next year and say, all right, the observance period is starting in 2 weeks. And then you get that, oh shit moment that you have to jump in the tool and you realize you're like 100 controls behind. And I've seen it in a couple of places where they got to the point where if they didn't fix these controls, the official SOC 2 Type 2 gets put on hold or taken away until you catch up again. And if you lose that, then you're in a really bad position because it's going to take another 6 months of observing and getting this all done. So in 2 cases, I just saw, because they didn't really listen to me at first. I'm like, look, we have to catch up on all these controls, or this will happen. And they're like, no, because the period doesn't start till then. And I'm like, well, that's not how it works. But then when we got the auditor on the phone, they said, if you don't have all these fixed by 2 weeks from now, then we're going to take away your certificate. And so that made all hands on deck, right? So stop everything you're doing. Let's get a project manager. Let's fix all these controls. And it's a 2 week running around like crazy until it's fixed. And nobody wants to be in that situation because it could stop you from selling. It could stop you from support. It could stop you from a whole bunch of different things. So lessons learned even by me during those things was, hey, make sure you're continuously checking your compliance. Put it on your calendar. Check the system once a week. Because generally all the alerts that come out of it get ignored. So I make sure that one of the developers or whoever's in charge of that looks at the console and takes care of any issues that pop up during that year.
So Todd, you mentioned a very interesting point around companies actually dropping the ball on monitoring the health of their controls after the audit is completed, and then have to go through a ton of pain at the time of the surveillance audit or the re-audits, right? Now, for a small company, they're often inundated with growth-related problems too. It makes a ton of sense to actually remain very vigilant towards the health of your controls. But how does it manifest? What are the things they could preempt and do better? Because there's a ton of literature out there in terms of what the SOC 2 controls are, what the ISO controls are. And so what can companies do better to sort of make life easier for themselves?
I mean, the whole point of getting your SOC 2 for a startup is to generate revenue, right? Like I mentioned, it gets you past the questionnaire. It gets you past worries of potential customers. And so if you lose that because you're not keeping up with it, that's going to be a big problem. And so I try to educate the CEOs and say, look, if you let your SOC 2 lapse, then you're going to look bad to your customers. And they're not going to buy anything, or you're going to lose them flat out, right? So as long as this CEO is managing that, or at least has awareness of that, he or she's going to make sure that it doesn't lapse and that people are on top of it. So that's where I usually start from.
Interestingly, Todd, one of the things that we hear GRC and security pundits talk about is that compliance doesn't equate security. But I think, and also the way a lot of people approach their compliance, it ends up looking like there's a ton of paperwork, there's a lot of bureaucracy they need to manage, there are audits they need to manage. But you've also seen enough examples of situations where, keeping the basics right, and the basics are essentially derived from the frameworks, the common frameworks like SOC 2, List 800, actually helps keep a reasonably healthy environment, at least for a small and mid-sized companies. And one of our earlier guests, Gary, stressed the importance of keeping things very simple. And what a lot of companies often don't realize is that both ISO 27001 and the SOC 2, while there is a canon that's established, they actually offer a lot of flexibility in terms of contextualizing the controls according to your environment. A lot of companies actually miss the point. You don't actually have to remain compliant with all the controls within ISO 27001, for example. It's perfectly okay to contextualize it, to keep it very simple, to build the statement of applicability, which is usually the first step around building a control library there. And if that expertise doesn't exist in-house, maybe it actually makes sense to work with a consultant, work with an expert, work with an advisor who can help companies navigate through the process of establishing heavily contextualized controls, or build a statement of applicability for ISO 27001, or in fact, if it's GDPR, build a record of processing activities, which would in turn give rise to the nature of controls you need to establish, depending on whether you're a controller, if you're a processor, who your sub-processors are, right? So I think that's a point which we observed being lost in many companies, because there's so much literature out there. They would just take a cookie cutter SOC 2 report, try to replicate that within the environment, but a lot of those controls may not even apply or may not even be stage appropriate. And I think that also creates a lot of overhead around remaining continuously compliant, because you're basically accumulating paperwork for controls that are not even relevant for you.
So there's a lot of education involved in all of this, right? And this is where you do need an accounting firm or some consultancy to guide you through all these. Because the auditors are going to come with their spreadsheets no matter what, even if they look in your system or they don't. And they're going to follow it step by step. And if you can't show the evidence, or if you can't provide why that doesn't apply to you in a really good way, then you're going to get red flagged. And so what I try to do, if I go back to my biotech days, because if we can sell our product because of a failed audit, and IT was always part of that audit, the CEO would be on my case. Hey, if we fail this audit because of you, you're doomed, right? Make sure it gets done no matter what it takes. And so I would get the spreadsheets ahead of time. I would make sure we had an answer for everything. So when the auditors come and do whatever they do in that room, before they come and ask me questions, I made sure I had everything ready to go as much as possible. But you have to be prepared, especially when we went from everything on-prem to cloud. And I was at a pharmaceutical company, and I moved all my stuff to Box, right? So all my stuff is in Box. So that was a red flag. CEO was all over me on that. But I was able to show the auditors how our data was much more secure sitting in Box than it was sitting in a closet in our office, right? And as long as I could demonstrate all their requirements and apply it the same way as I did on-premise in the cloud, then they understood it and we got the pass.
So, Todd, you mentioned a very interesting point about using a compliance automation tool or a GRC automation tool as a way to smartly manage compliance on a continuous basis, or as a way to monitor the health of controls on a continuous basis. Now, there's a level of nuance to it because you worked in a large setup. You also worked in a small setup, and even within the large setup, you've seen its evolution from being on-prem to being on the cloud. Right? So, as companies grow in maturity or complexity, how do you see the thesis around GRC automation manifesting? What was different for a large company versus a small company that you worked with?
So, I mean, the small companies, it's a lot easier because they only have to do one or two compliances, right? You have fewer people. And when you have an automated tool like Scrut or anything else, the automation really helps maintain that level of compliance. And it does all the heavy lifting for you. Whereas a large company, they might have multiple frameworks, multiple compliances that they need to follow. So it's really important for them to have some kind of unified control framework where the tool can handle multiple frameworks and show where each one overlaps each other. So if you follow one control for this framework, it maps to this other one for this compliance. So you don't have to duplicate effort into that. And so that's probably one of the biggest differences that I see.
So Todd, one question I have for you is, now you spent a lot of time in your career working across compliance and GRC problem statements in healthcare companies. And since 2020, when you started advising startups, you actually started working a lot with technology companies, like software companies. So just in terms of the nature of the frameworks involved and the way the audits were conducted, what was different across these two environments?
So in biotech and pharma, the compliances were HIPAA, SOX, lab certifications, all kinds of very specific to healthcare audits, right? And so it was not just IT involved, it was the labs, it was the finance team, it was a whole bunch of teams that were involved. And so the audit process was much longer. And we basically took our turns with the auditors, right? Because the way it always worked is we had a war room with the copier, and then we had to produce all the documents that the auditors were asking for in the next room over. So it was this whole thing where the printer could not be part of the network, it had to be separate, and there was all these auditing rules to get through these audits, and they took forever, right? It would take 6 months to get through some of these audits. And then sometimes they would have surprise audits. And you basically have to shut down for however long they're going to be there and answer all their questions and have a whole team assigned for this. It's like a incident response plan, only it's a audit response plan, essentially. And so IT was just a small part of that, because back then we didn't have, we had basic security and things like that, but it was, hey, how's your data flow? How do you control your data? Who's accessing your data? Where it's sitting? There's nothing about encryption or anything back then. But it was basic questions like that. Is my data secure? Whereas coming to tech companies and doing SOC 2s and ISOs, those are much simpler, I think. It's mostly focused on security controls. And especially when you have automated tools like Scrut and others, it makes it very easy, especially for born in the cloud companies that want these SOC 2s. Mid-market, it's a little different because you probably already have big established customers, and the demand for SOC 2 and ISO will come from them, not necessarily internally. Generally, you're going to want to assign somebody or have a accounting or auditing firm as a consultant on your team to help you get through those. Those are the biggest differences I see.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks a lot for taking the time for doing this episode with us. And as promised to the viewers, Todd will be back as the host for the rest of the episodes in season 2. This is Ayush signing off. Thanks for your patience. Bye.